And so we settle in. You can feel your body beginning to grow heavy in the most pleasant way. In our time together tonight, there is nothing to examine and nothing to understory. A story that begins not with kings or with battles, but with the ringing of bells and the turning of pages in a city that was just beginning to awaken to its own brilliance. The story of a mind so sharp it could cut through dogma, and all of that would be remembered for 1,000 years. Before we drift too far, if you feel a connection to this place, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. Think of it not as a task, but as leaving a soft footprint in the sand before you continue your journey inward. And if you feel so inclined, you could let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's a quiet comfort to know we're all resting under the same wide sky. Alright, let the shadows in your room grow long and soft. Maybe you can hear the faint sound of your own breathing. And together, let's allow the story to begin. The year isn't important, not exactly. Just know that it is the 12th century, and you are in Paris. But this isn't the Paris of grand boulevards and twinkling iron towers. Not yet. This is a different city, a grittier one, a city of wood and plaster, of mud and faith. You're standing on the Ile site, a small island in the middle of the River Seine, the very heart of this growing town. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp river stone, and from a nearby bakery, the undeniably comforting scent of baking bread, and above all the other sounds, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of the merchants, the lowing of cattle being led to market. You hear bells, a constant, overlapping chorus of bells. They ring from dozens of churches, small chapels, and the rising skeleton of a great new cathedral they're calling Notre Dame. The bells mark the time, they call the faithful to prayer, they warn of fires, they celebrate births. Your feet, probably clad in simple leather shoes, find the ground uneven. The streets are narrow, are paved lanes that twist and turn like tangled threads. Tall, timber-framed houses lean towards each other, their upper floors jutting out so far that they almost touch, creating a permanent twilight in the alleys below. You learn quickly to walk in the middle of the street. This isn't just for avoiding the muck and the mire, but because it was common practice to simply shout a warning before emptying a chamber pot from an overhead window. It's a small but vital piece of local knowledge. You probably won't survive your first day without learning it. But it isn't the architecture or the bells that make Paris the most exciting place in Europe right now. It's the ideas. This city is the world's brain. It has become a magnet for the brightest minds of the age. From all across the known world, from England, from the Italian city-states, from the kingdoms of Spain, young men flock here, hungry for knowledge. They gather around the Cathedral School of Notre Dame and the Abbey of St. Genevieve, forming a chaotic, vibrant, and argumentative community of scholars. Historians still argue about the exact moment these scattered schools officially became the University of Paris. There was no grand opening ceremony, no ribbon to be cut. It was a slow, organic, and probably quite messy evolution, more of a guild of thinkers than a campus with buildings. They own no lecture halls. Instead, you see them everywhere. A master might rent a room or simply gather his students in a church cloister or on a street corner if the weather is good. You can feel the energy buzzing in the air, a kind of intellectual electricity. The language of this world is Latin. You hear it spoken with a dozen different accents, debated with passion and fury. These students are arguing about Aristotle, who is being rediscovered, about the nature of God, the meaning of reality, the rules of logic. It's the birth of scholasticist, a rigorous, almost ruthless, method of philosophical debate. Think of it as the 12th century version of an internet flame war, but with much better grammar and a sincere concern for the fate of one's immortal soul. In this city of bells and brains, a scholar's reputation is everything. It is his currency, his armor, his weapon. And a great teacher, one who is brilliant and charismatic, can draw students by the hundreds, becoming a kind of celebrity. His lectures are the talk of the town. His arguments are dissected and repeated in every tavern. And in all of Paris, in all of Europe, there is no name more famous, more brilliant, or more dangerously arrogant than that of Peter Abelard. His story, and ours, is about to begin. You find a space on the straw-strewn floor of a rented room near the cathedral. It's crowded, warm, and smells of damp wool and concentrated thought. Young men, some barely old enough to grow a beard, are crammed onto benches or perched on barrels, their faces upturned with an almost hungry look of anticipation. They clutch wax tablets on styluses, ready to capture every precious word. This is where it happens. This is the lecture hall of Peter Abelard, and then he enters. H.E.S. in his late 30s, and he moves with a confidence that borders on theatrical. He isn't a physically imposing man, not a knight in armor, but he carries himself as if H.E.S. the most important person in any room he enters and in this world. He usually is. His clerical robes are simple, but on him, they seem like the uniform of a general. He ascends the small wooden platform at the front of the room, and a hush falls over the crowd. He doesn't shout, but his voice cuts through the silence with incredible precision. It's a voice made for dissecting arguments, for laying traps of logic, for turning an opponent's own words against them. And today, he is on the attack. He is taking aim at the philosophical giants of the day, including his own former teacher, William of Champeaux. The topic is something called the problem of universals, which sounds incredibly dull, I know. But in the 12th century, it's the intellectual equivalent of a heavyweight championship fight. The question is simple, but the implications are vast. Let's say you see a chair. We both know they are chairs. The question is, does a perfect, ideal form of chairness exist somewhere in a heavenly dimension, and all our physical chairs are just pale copies of it? That's what the old god, the realists, would argue. Abelard scoffs at this. You can see it in the slight curl of his lip. He paces the platform, his arguments flowing effortlessly. He contends that there is no magical chairness floating in the ether. There are only individual chairs. Chair, he argues, is just a word, a concept, a name a nomen in Latin that we use to group similar objects. It exists in our minds, not in some divine reality. This idea, known as nominalism, is radical. Unknowable divine forms and places it into the hands of human reason and language. You watch as he dismantles the opposing view, piece by piece, with the cold artistry of a master jeweler. He exposes contradictions, reveals absurdities. The students are mesmerized. This is why they pay their fees to him, and not to another master. He isn't just teaching them what to think. He is teaching them how to think, with a ruthless and a little clarity. He is a little secret about this intellectual gladiator. He was never meant for this life. Peter Abelard was born the eldest son of a minor noble in Brittany. His future was mapped out for him. He was to inherit his father's lands, learn the arts of war, and become a knight. But from a young age, you see, he found himself drawn not to the sword, but to the quill. He was captivated by logic. And so, in an act that must have shocked his family, he renounced his birthright. He gave up his inheritance, his title, and his future as a feudal lord, trading it all for the life of a wandering scholar. He chose Aristotle over Acres. Some might see it as a noble sacrifice for the pursuit of knowledge. Others might see it as the first great act of a lifelong habit, choosing exactly what Peter Abelard wanted, regardless of tradition or expectation. His success has been staggering. He arrived in Paris as a student and quickly humiliated his own teachers in public debates. He set up his own schools, and the students flocked to him, abandoning their former masters. He is witty, charming when he wants to be, and utterly merciless in an argument. He has, in his own words, become the only philosopher of any fame in the whole world. And he knows it. The arrogance radiates from him. It's a suit of armor he never takes off. Scholars still debate whether this immense pride was a fatal flaw or the very engine of his genius. Was he a defiant hero of reason, or just a man completely in love with the sound of his own brilliant voice? The answer, as is often the case, is probably a bit of both. As he concludes his lecture, a wave of admiration ripples through the room. He has conquered the world of the mind. He stands alone atop a mountain of his own making, without rival. He is famous, sought after, and he believes completely in control of his destiny. But there is another world, one of philosophy books and wax tablets, that he has not yet even entered a world of the heart, and his journey into that uncharted territory is about to begin, not in a lecture hall, but in a quiet, private study just a few streets away. You leave the charged atmosphere of the lecture and walk a short distance, deeper into the warren of streets that huddle around the cathedral. You arrive at the stone house of one of the cathedral's most respected officials, a man named F.U.L. Burt. He is a canon of Notre Dame, a position of significant authority and comfort. His home is not a palace, but it is solid, respectable, and a world away from the rowdy student hostels. Inside, the rooms are dim, lit by the milky light filtering through small, glass-paned windows, a sign of considerable wealth. The air smells of beeswax and old parchment. It is here, in this quiet, scholarly household, that you meet her, Helois. She is young, perhaps only 17 or 18, but to mistake her youth for naivety would be a grave error. There is an intensity in her gaze, a stillness in her posture that suggests a mind constantly at work. While other young women of her class would be learning to manage a household, practicing embroidery, and preparing for an advantageous marriage, Helois is doing something far more unusual. She is not just reading prayers or romantic tales. She is devouring the classics. She is fluent in Latin, the language of scholarship, and is already known for her proficiency in Greek and even Hebrew. This is astonishingly rare for anyone, let alone a woman of this era. Most of the famous scholars in Paris would be hard-pressed to match her linguistic skills. Her reputation, though quieter than Abelard's, has already begun to spread through the city's intellectual circles. People speak of Canon F.U.L. Burt's niece with a kind of hush-talk. A marvel of learning, they call her a prodigy. She is an orphan, and her uncle, F.U.L. Burt, has raised her. He is immensely proud of her, perhaps even possessively so. He sees her not as a commodity to be married off for political or financial gain, but as a masterpiece of his own cultivation. He has poured resources into her education, ensuring she has the best tutors, the best books. He dotes on her, and in his pride, he openly boasts of her accomplishments to his colleagues. This is, as you'll soon see, a crucial mistake. Her brilliance is a double-edged sword. It brings her fame, but it also makes her visible. In a world where women's intellectual lives were almost entirely confined to the cloister, Helois is an anomaly. A strange and beautiful flower blooming in a walled garden. There's a debate among historians as to just how radical her position was. Some argue that noble women often received strong educations, and she wasn't a complete outlier. Others insist that the depth and philosophical nature of her learning put her in a category all her own, making her a true phenomenon. No one disputes that for a young woman in 12th century Paris, she was a true intellectual powerhouse. And here's a small detail that speaks volumes. Because she was not a man, she could not formally debate or publish her own treatises. Her entire world of learning was confined to the walls of her uncle's house. Imagine having a mind as sharp as any in Paris, but being barred from the arena where those minds were tested and celebrated. Imagine hearing the distant roar of the intellectual battles being fought just streets away, knowing you could compete, but being denied a sword. There must have been a deep, unspoken frustration within her, a hunger for a true meeting of minds. She looks up from the illuminated manuscript she is studying. The pages are filled with the dense, complex arguments of a church father. For a moment, she is just a young woman in a quiet room. But her existence is a quiet challenge to the entire order of her world. A world that has produced the swaggering genius of Peter Abelard, a man who believes he has no equal. He has conquered the public stage of philosophy. She has mastered the private world of texts. He is all sound and fury. She is all quiet intensity. They are, in a way, two halves of a perfect whole. The most famous male scholar in Paris, and the most accomplished female scholar in Paris, and they live just a few streets apart. Canon F.U.L. Burt, in his swelling pride, hears the endless praise for Abelard, and he has an idea. A brilliant, simple, and utterly catastrophic idea. What if he could hire the greatest teacher in the world to be the private tutor for his niece, the most gifted student in the world? It would be a perfect arrangement, a capstone to her already dazzling education. He begins to make inquiries. The proposal, when it reaches Peter Abelard, must have seemed too good to be true. He tells you this himself years later, in the brutally honest memoir he will write. He admits that he had already heard the stories of Helois. Her reputation for learning had reached him, and his curiosity was piqued, but it was her uncle's boasting that truly set the trap. Ful Bert, in his desire to show off his niece, had created the one thing Abelard could never resist. But Abelard's interest was not purely academic. At this point in his life, he was at the zenith of his fame. He was admired, wealthy from student fees, and, as he confesses with a distinct lack of humility, he was not an unattractive man. He had, until now, lived a life of chastity, not necessarily out of piety, but because the intense demands of his career had left little room for romantic entanglements. Love affairs were a distraction, a messy complication he had no time for. But now something has shifted. Perhaps it was the complacency of success. Perhaps it was a simple human loneliness he would never admit to. He decided, with the same cool logic he applied to a philosophical problem, that it was time he experienced love, and as he surveyed the landscape of Paris, his eyes fell upon Helois. He saw the situation with a strategist's sigh. He was a young woman of legendary intelligence and, by all accounts, considerable beauty. She was isolated in her uncle's home, and that uncle, Ful Bert, was practically begging Abelard to enter his household. The man was so blinded by his ambition for his niece's education that he was offering unfettered access to her day and night. Abelard sought, as a perfect campaign, an easy conquest. The negotiations are almost comical in their one-sideness. Ful Bert approaches Abelard, offering him lodging in his own house, a place at his table, and a handsome fee. All he asks in return is that Abelard devote his spare time, after his public lectures, to the private instruction of his niece. Abelard, feigning a slight reluctance, makes a counteroffer that is pure genius in its audacity. He tells Ful Bert that his own studies are a heavy burden and that managing his own household is a distraction. Living in Ful Bert's home would be ideal. As for payment, forget it. The lodging is enough, but he makes one small, seemingly innocent request. He asks for permission to discipline his student as he sees fit. He even suggests with a straight face that if he should find her idle, he should be allowed to employ the threat of the rod. In an age where physical correction was a standard part of education, this request would have seemed perfectly normal. Ful Bert, overjoyed at securing the services of the great Abelard for free, agrees enthusiastically. He is so eager, he essentially hands over complete authority of his niece to a man he barely knows. He sees Abelard as a teacher. Abelard sees himself as a hunter, and the trap has just been perfectly laid. There's a small, sad footnote to this arrangement. Some historians have pointed out a peculiar aspect of medieval law. A cleric in major orders, like an Ful Bert, was forbidden from having women in his house unless they were close relatives, to avoid any suspicion of scandal. A niece was one of the few exceptions. By raising Helois, Ful Bert had inadvertently created a respectable, permissible reason for a young woman to be in his home. He had followed the rules, but in doing so, he had created the very conditions for the scandal that would ruin him. And so you watch as Master Abelard moves his books and belongings into Canon Ful Bert's house. He is welcomed as an honored guest, a revered master. Ful Bert beams with pride, imagining the brilliant philosophical discussions that will now fill his home. He tells his friends how lucky he is. He instructs his niece to obey her new tutor in all things. The door closes. The two of them are now under the same roof. The most brilliant man in Paris, and the most brilliant woman. The stage is set. The lessons are about to begin, and absolutely no one, except perhaps Abelard himself, has any idea what is truly about to be taught. You are now a silent observer in that quiet study. The heavy door is closed, shutting out the noise of the Parisian streets and, more importantly, the watchful eyes of Canon Ful Bert. The room is dominated by a heavy wooden table, its surface littered with manuscripts and wax tablets. Light, thick with dancing dust motes, slants in from the window. The only sounds are the rustle of vellum, the faint scratching of a stylus, and the low murmur of their voices. At first, the lessons are exactly what F.U.L. Burt imagined. They are a rigorous, exhilarating exercise of the mind. Abelard, the master dialectician, doesn't just lecture, he challenges. He presents Helois with contradictory pioneered in his book Sic et Non, or Yes and No. He essentially puts the holy texts on trial, forcing her to use logic and reason to reconcile what seem to be irreconcilable statements. The scriptures seem to argue both. It is her job to find the path through the paradox, and she is brilliant at it. You can see the flicker of astonishment in Abelard's eyes, an expression he probably isn't used to having. He has spent his life surrounded by the best young minds in Europe, but he has never encountered anyone like her. She is not just a passive vessel for his knowledge. She is a true intellectual sparring partner. She anticipates his arguments, counters with her own, cites obscure text from memory, and pushes him into corners he didn't expect. Her mind is a lock he has never encountered before, and his is the key. Their discussions are a kind of dance, a rapid, thrilling exchange of ideas that leaves them both breathless. This is the mainstream history part. Their connection was forged in the fire of scholastic debate. It was a genuine meeting of two extraordinary minds, but, as the days turn into weeks, you notice a subtle shift. The formal distance between master and student begins to dissolve. The space between their chairs at the table grows smaller. When he points to a passage in the manuscript, his hand lingers just a fraction of a second too long near hers. The arguments about Plato and theology are still there, but they become interspersed with shared glances that hold more meaning than any philosophical text. Let's pause and consider the books themselves. A single manuscript in the 12th century was an object of immense value. Paper made from wood pulp is still centuries away. These books are made of parchment or vellum, the painstakingly prepared skins of sheep or calves. Each one had to be scraped, stretched, and treated. A single large Bible could require the hides of over 100 animals. Every word is written by hand with a quill pen, a process that took a scribe months, even years. These are not disposable paperbacks. They are treasures. The fact that F.U.L. Burt's library is extensive enough for these two to have so much material is a testament to his wealth and her privileged position. The intellectual intimacy soon bleeds into something else entirely. The lessons on rhetoric, the art of persuasion, become lessons in flirtation. The study of classical love poetry becomes an excuse to speak of their own burgeoning feelings. Abelard, who had planned this as a cold-blood seduction, finds himself completely disarmed. He came expecting to conquer, but he is the one being captured. He confesses later that their passion quickly outstripped their interest in philosophy. Our hands strayed more often to each other than to the books, he would write, and our eyes met more often than they read the holy texts. Historians have long debated the nature of these early moments. Was this a powerful man grooming his young, isolated student? Or was it a meeting of equals, to people who had been intellectually lonely their entire lives, who finally found in each other a companion who could understand the deepest workings of their soul? Helias's own writings, years later, suggest she was no passive victim. She speaks of a love born of shared genius, a magnetic attraction that was as much mental as it was physical. You watch as the pretense of their lessons melts away. The formal structure is gone. Now the study is their sanctuary, their secret world. They spend hours together, ostensibly reading, but the real text they are studying is each other. Abelard, the man who renounced a knight's inheritance for a life of the mind, now finds himself completely undone by a force that logic cannot explain or contain. He is, for the first time in his celebrated life, no longer in control, but for the first time no one is reading. The dynamic in the study has now completely changed. The formal lessons have become a thin veil for a passionate and all-consuming love affair. The pretense of education is still there, a shield to present to the outside world, particularly to the unsuspecting canon F.U.L. Burt. But within the four walls of that room, they are simply Peter and Helois. You see it in the small details. The way they now sit side by side at the grey table, their shoulders almost touching. A discarded wax tablet, once used for diagramming logical arguments, now bears a hastily scribbled line of poetry. Abelard's voice, which can command the attention of hundreds in a lecture hall, softens to a whisper when he speaks to her. The air, which once crackled with intellectual energy, is now thick with a different kind of tension, a quiet, magnetic pull. Abelard, the master strategist, the man who planned this affair like a military campaign, is completely lost. He writes that his lectures began to suffer. He who could once generate brilliant new arguments on the spot now finds himself merely repeating old lessons. His mind is elsewhere. His students notice. You can imagine them murmuring in the taverns, wondering what has happened to their once fiery master. He seems distracted, his razor-sharp wit dulled by some unknown preoccupation. The work that was once the entire focus of existence has become a chore, a tedious interruption to the hours he can spend with Helois. The books on the table become props in their secret play. They will open a heavy volume of St. Augustine's writings, its dense Latin text filling the vellum page. To anyone glancing into the room, they are the very picture of scholarly devotion. But their fingers are intertwined beneath the table. Their whispered conversations are not about theological doctrine, but about the future, about their feelings, about the sheer impossibility and the undeniable reality of their situation. He confesses in his memoir that there was more kissing than explaining, more love than learning. Here's a curious, slightly absurd detail of their affair. Abelard confesses that he sometimes resorted to the very permission Fuelbert had granted him, the right to discipline his student. He writes that their love sought the seclusion that love desires, and if Fuelbert or other members of the household were suspicious, blows were sometimes exchanged, but blows of love, not of anger. It's a bizarre and slightly uncomfortable image, the two of them staging a fake argument, complete with shouted words and perhaps even the sound of a slap, all to cover the sounds of their affection. It's a desperate, almost farcical attempt to maintain their cover story. The very to love authority became a conspiratorial game. This period is a source of ongoing academic discussion. Was Helois truly a willing and equal partner in this deception? Medieval societal norms would have placed her in a position of extreme vulnerability. She was his student, living under his authority in her guardian's house. A modern perspective might see a deeply problematic power imbalance. Yet, her own later writings are fierce and unapologetic about her love. She never portrays herself as a victim of seduction. She writes of a love she chose freely, a passion she embraced with her eyes wide open. She insists that she would have preferred the title of his lover to that of his wife, even Empress of the world. Untangling the threads of agency and coercion across 9 centuries is a task that keeps historians endlessly occupied. The love between them is no longer just a secret kept within the study. It begins to spill out to find other forms of expression. Abelard, the logician, the philosopher of cold, hard reason, rediscovers an art form from his youth in Brittany: songwriting. He had been known as a composer and performer of songs before his philosophical career took off. Now, inspired by Helois, he begins to write again. He composes love songs, not in the scholarly Latin of his books, but in the vernacular French of the common people. These aren't dry academic exercises. They are songs filled with passion, with longing, and with her name. They are intensely personal, and they are incredibly catchy. Soon, the students of Paris are singing them. The merchants in the market are humming them. The songs spread through the city like a delightful virus. Abelard's secret love affair, which began behind the closed door of a study, has just been broadcast to the entire city. And everyone, it seems, knows who he's singing about, that is, except for one man, the last man to know, Canon Fuelbert. The city of Paris is now the unwitting audience to a romance playing out in public. Abelard's songs are everywhere. You can hear them being strummed on a lute in a tavern, sung by a group of rowdy students crossing a bridge over the Seine, or even hummed by a woman selling apples at a market stall. They are beautiful, passionate, and utterly unsubtle. The name Helois echoes through the narrow, winding street. It becomes the greatest gossip in a city that thrives on it. In the world of the university, where reputations are currency, the affair is a source of endless speculation and, for Abelard's rivals, a delicious scandal. They had long resented his arrogance, and now they have a weapon. They watch him whispering behind their hands, noting his distraction, his new, less than scholarly focus. They see his public infatuation as proof that the great logician has finally been felled by the most illogical of forces. Abelard, for his part, seems completely consumed, almost drunk on this new fame. He is no longer just the greatest lover, its most celebrated troubadour. It's a new kind of celebrity, and he leans into it. The secrecy that once defined their affair has evaporated, replaced by a kind of reckless, public performance of his love. You have to wonder what Helois thought of this. Did she find it romantic? This grand, public declaration. A woman raised in a household where discretion was paramount feel a rising sense of dread at this brazen carelessness. Her own voice from this period is silent, filtered entirely through Abelard's desolated telling of the story. One fascinating aspect of this is the tradition of courtly love, which was just beginning to blossom in the culture of 12th century France. This was a new, revolutionary way of thinking about romance. It often involved a knight or a poet idolizing a high-born, usually married, lady from afar. The love was meant to be secret, chaste and ennobling. Abelard, in a way, took this new trend and turned it on its head. His love was not for a distant, unattainable lady, but for his own student, under her guardian's roof. And it was certainly not chaste. He was playing with a new set of cultural rules, but breaking the most important ones. The sheer obliviances of Canon F.U.L. Bert during this time is almost painful to watch. He is a man wrapped in a cocoon of pride and denial. He hears the songs, of course. He hears the gossip. But he simply cannot believe it. His niece, the model of piety and scholarly devotion, and Master Abelard, the most brilliant philosopher in Christendom, a man whose life is dedicated to the church and to reason. The idea is preposterous. He dismisses the rumors as the jealous slander of Abelard's enemies. His faith in them, and in his own judgment, is absolute. He is the last to know, a figure of pity and impending tragedy. It's a classic comedic setup, the clueless guardian, but you know it's not going to end in laughter. Every stolen glance, every secret meeting, every new song that captures the city's imagination is another thread being woven into a net that is tightening around them all. The affair continues, a whirlwind of passion and intellectual fire. Abelard and Helois are living in a bubble of their own creation, a world where the only things that matter are their love and their work. They are two brilliant minds, isolated by their own genius, who have found a universe in each other. They are so engrossed in this universe that they fail to see how fragile its walls are. Historians still debate how long this idyllic, if reckless, period lasted. Was it a few intense months? Was it closer to a year? Abelard's own account is frustratingly vague on the timeline. But time, as it always does, was running out. The bubble was about to burst. And the catalyst would not be the gossip of the city or the suspicions of Abelard's rivals. It would be something far more undeniable. A simple biological truth that no amount of logic or philosophy could argue away. It would begin with a dawning realization, a quiet change within Helois's own body. The music of the city, once a soundtrack to their romance, begins to sound different now, sharper, more dangerous. Abelard's songs are still being sung, but for the two lovers, the lyrics have a hollow ring. Their world has contracted once more, pulling back from the reckless public display into the realm of whispered secrets. The reason is simple, profound, and as old as time itself. It is Helois who knows first. There are no physicians to consult, no tests to confirm it. In the 12th century, the knowledge of a pregnancy was a woman's secret, a truth revealed by the body's own quiet calendar. It was a matter of counting the days, of noticing a subtle shift in her own rhythms, a new and unfamiliar weariness. There is a term from this era, the quickening, which describes the first time a mother feels the fetus move within her. This moment was considered the point when the child received its soul. Whether she had reached that point or not, the conclusion becomes inescapable. She carries their child. You can imagine the moment she tells him. Not in the study, amidst the books and the remnants of their lessons, but in a stolen moment in a garden, or in a hushed corner of the house, where no one can overhear. The words are simple, and they land with the force of a physical blow, shattering the dreamlike state they had been living in. You might expect panic, a frantic search for a solution, a bitter regret. But Abelard, in his own telling of the story, describes his reaction with one surprising word: joy. He writes that he was overjoyed. He, the celibate scholar, the man of pure reason, was to be a father. In his mind, this was the ultimate validation of their love, a tangible creation born from their meeting of minds and bodies. And it's here that historians pause and scratch their heads. Was he truly that happy? Or is this a man writing years later, casting his past in a more romantic, noble light? The sheer, catastrophic reality of their situation must have crashed down upon him moments after that initial emotion. Let's be clear. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was ruin. For Abelard, a public career in the church or the university was built on the assumption of celibacy, while many clerics of the time discreetly kept mistresses. Having a child, and having that child with a famous young woman under his tutelage, was a scandal of a different magnitude. It would be the end of his reputation, his teaching career, his ambition. He would become a laughingstock, the arrogant philosopher brought low by the most common of human frailties. For Helois, the consequences were arguably even worse. A woman's honor was her most valuable asset. A pregnancy outside of marriage would mark her for life. She would be seen as a fallen woman, her intellectual gifts overshadowed by her moral disgrace. Any prospect of a respectable marriage, or even a quiet, scholarly life would be gone forever. And then there was Ful Bert. His pride, his honor, his entire world was invested in his niece. The betrayal would be absolute. The public humiliation would be unbearable. His love for her would curdle into a rage that you can already begin to feel gathering like a storm cloud over the city. The joy, if it ever truly existed, quickly gives way to the cold, hard necessity of a plan. They cannot stay in Paris. They cannot face Ful Bert. They have to run. And so in the dead of night, the great logician and the brilliant scholar become something new. Conspirators. They hatch a desperate plan. Abelard has a sister in Brittany, his family home. It is a safe haven, far from Paris, far from the reach of her uncle. The plan is to smuggle Helois out of the city, disguised. You watch as they prepare. The intellectual games are over. The love songs have fallen silent. Their existence is now a frantic series of whispered conversations and secret preparations. Abelard arranges for her escape. He tells Ful Bert a story, perhaps that the academic pressure is too much for her, that she needs a rest at a nearby convent. The lie must be plausible enough to buy them time. Then one night, it happens. Under the cover of darkness, Helois, dressed not as a scholar, but in the simple habit of a nun, slips out of her uncle's house. This disguise is a bitter piece of irony, a foreshadowing of a future she cannot yet imagine. She meets Abelard in a predetermined spot. The streets of Paris, once the stage for their love, are now a maze they must navigate to escape. Every shadow seems to hold a threat. Every distant shout sends a jolt of fear through them. This isn't a romantic elopement. It is a flight born of desperation. They are running for their lives, or at least, the lives they have known. The journey to Brittany is long and arduous. It's a distance of several hundred miles, and in the 12th century, this is no simple trip. You travel with them, not on paved highways, but on rough, often muddy tracks that cut through dense forests and sparsely populated countryside. They would travel on horseback, the steady, rhythmic lopping of the hooves a constant companion. At night, they would stay in noisy, crowded inns or, if they were lucky, find shelter in a monastery that offered hospitality to travelers. For Helois, this journey is a radical departure from everything she has ever known. Her entire life has been spent within the sheltered, intellectual confines of her uncle's house in Paris. Now she is in the wide, unpredictable world, a fugitive in a nun's disguise. The irony of her costume is thick. The nun's habit was a symbol of a woman who had renounced the world and carnal love. She wears it now to hide the consequences of that very love. Each passing day, the child within her grows, a secret she carries beneath the woolen folds of her habit. Abelard, too, is out of his element. He is a man of the city, of the lecture hall. The challenges of the road, finding safe passage, dealing with suspicious innkeepers, avoiding bandits, are a different kind of test than a philosophical debate. He is no longer the celebrated Master Abelard. He is just a man, protecting the woman he loves and their unborn child. The arrogance and intellectual pride seem to fall away, replaced by a raw, protective instinct. This journey strips them down to their essentials. They finally arrive at his family home in the Palette, a small town in Brittany. It's a world away from the bustling, intellectual hub of Paris. Here, the language is different, the customs are different, the very air feels different. Abelard's sister, whose name history has unfortunately not preserved, welcomes them. She takes Helois in, offering a sanctuary where she can finally shed her disguise and her fear. You can imagine the quiet months that follow. For Helois, it is a time of waiting. The frantic energy of Paris is replaced by the slow, pastoral rhythms of the countryside. She is surrounded not by scholars, but by a family preparing for the arrival of a new life. She would have helped with household tasks, walked in the green fields, and felt the baby grow stronger. What were her thoughts during this time? What were her thoughts during this time? Was there a sense of peace in this enforced quiet? A temporary reprieve from the scandal she had left behind. One detail that's often debated is the level of contact she had with Abelard during this period. Did he stay with her in Brittany? Or did he, as was more likely, return to Paris to try and manage the fallout and maintain his teaching career, visiting her when he could? His own account is unclear, but it's almost certain he was by her side for the entire duration. He was a man with a life and a reputation to protect, and his place was in Paris. And then the moment arrives. In the care of Abelard's sister, Helois gives birth to a son. They give him a name that is as unusual and as intellectually ambitious as they are. Astrolabe. An astrolabe was a complex and beautiful astronomical instrument, a kind of medieval supercomputer used to measure the position of the stars. It was a tool of science, of navigation, of understanding the cosmos. To name a child Astrolabe was a bold statement. It was a fusion of their two worlds, the love of knowledge and the fruit of their love, a name that seemed to declare that this child, born of such a scandalous union, was not a source of shame, but a marvel, a wonder, a key to the universe. There's a sad and poignant bit of trivia about this unique name. In all of the historical records of the time, the name Astrolabe appears only a handful of times. It was incredibly rare. Some scholars even suggest that Abelard and Helois may have invented it as a name, adapting it directly from the instrument. Whether that's true or not, it speaks to their shared identity as intellectuals. They didn't name him Peter or Albert. They named him for a concept, for an idea for the stars. The birth of their son is a moment of profound joy, but it is a joy that exists in a fragile, temporary peace. Back in Paris, Fulbert's confusion and worry have been festering. His niece has been gone for months. The lies and excuses are wearing thin. The truth, or at least a version of it, is about to reach him, and his reaction will set in motion the next, and his reaction will set in motion the next, and his reaction will set in motion the next, and most tragic chapter of their lives. The quiet idyll in Brittany is over, while Helois is finding a fragile peace in the Breton countryside, nursing her newborn son Astrolabe. The situation back in Paris has deteriorated into a state of quiet, simmering fury. The truth is out. Can a nephew Albert now knows everything? How he found out is a matter of some speculation. Did Abelard in a moment of hubris or foolishness confess? Did a letter go astray? Or did the gossip of Paris, relentless and pervasive, finally reach us or so credible that Albert could no longer deny it? The most likely scenario is that Abelard himself, realizing he couldn't hide the truth forever, eventually told him. He had to. The disappearance of Helois, followed by the birth of a child, could not be explained away by any other means. You must try to imagine the scene of this confession. It would not have been a calm, reasoned discussion. You were standing in the study, the very room where the affair began. The books are still on the shelves, cited witnesses. Albert, a man whose entire identity is built on his position in the church and his reputation for piety, is confronted with a betrayal that is absolute and multifaceted. The man he welcomed into his home as a trusted colleague and teacher has violated his trust in the most profound way possible. He has not only seduced his niece, but he has done so under the guise of providing her an education in Fulbr's own house. And his beloved niece, the brilliant, virtuous girl who was the source of all his pride, has deceived him, colluded in the affair, and borne a child out of wedlock. It's a humiliation that strikes at his family honor, his professional standing, and his personal affection. The rage you see in Fulbr's eyes is not just anger. It is the fury of a man whose world has been shattered. The love he had for Helo stirred a less into a venomous sense of betrayal. The respect he had for Abelard transforms into a deep, consuming hatred. He had been made a fool of, and the entire city of Paris knew it before he did. Abelard's love songs, which he had once dismissed as idle gossip, now sound in his memory like mocking taunts. Abelard, for his part, seems to fundamentally misunderstand the depth of this rage. He is at his core a logician. He sees the situation as a problem to be solved. He has committed a role, and now he must offer a solution that will, in a rational way, repair the damage. He believes that Fulbr's anger is primarily about the damage to his family's reputation and Helias's future prospects. And so, he makes what he believes is an honorable and generous offer. He tells Fulbert that he will do what no one expected a man in his position to do. He will marry Helois. This offer is, in Abelard's mind, an enormous sacrifice. A formal marriage would be an absolute bar to any further advancement in the church hierarchy, the traditional path for a great scholar. He would effectively end his chances of becoming a bishop or an abbot. He would be, for all intents and purposes, a layman. To him, this is the ultimate penance, a grand gesture that should appease Fulbr's anger and restore honor to everyone involved. But he adds one crucial, and ultimately fatal condition. The marriage must be kept secret. His reasoning is, from his perspective, perfectly sound. A secret marriage would satisfy Fulbr's honor in private. It would legitimize their son, and it would give Helois the status of a wife. But to the outside world, Abelard would remain a celibate scholar, his career intact. He could continue to teach, to write, to be the great Master Abelard. He is trying to have it both ways, to be an honorable husband in private and a free-thinking public intellectual. It's an attempt to apply logic to a situation that is now governed by raw, wounded emotion. Here's a curious tidbit about clerical marriage at the time. The rules on celibacy were tightening, but they were not as ironclad as they would later become. The First Lateran Council in 1123, just a few years after these events, would formally forbid priests in major orders from marrying. Before that, the rules were a bit fuzzy. There were many clerics, even bishops, who had wives or long-term partners. The practice was officially frowned upon, but often tolerated. Abelard's fear was less about breaking a strict law and more about the damage to his academic brand. He was a philosopher monk, and a wife and child didn't fit the image. Fulbert listens to this proposal. You see him considering it. A secret marriage. It's not perfect, but it's something. It's a way to salvage some small piece of his family's honor. He agrees. They shake hands. A pact is made. For a fleeting moment, it seems as though disaster has been narrowly averted, but Abelard has made a critical error. He has judged Fulbert's character by his own. He believes the man is rational. He has failed to see that the wound he inflicted is not a matter of honor that can be patched over with a secret contract. With a fragile truce declared, Abelard makes the long journey back to Brittany. He has a new mission: to retrieve Helois and their son and to convince her to accept his plan. He finds her in the quiet country home of his sister, her life now revolving around the small, demanding presence of their baby, Astrolo. You can picture the scene. He lays out his proposal to her. He explains the deal he has struck with her uncle. He will make her his wife, he tells her, but they must keep their union a secret to preserve his career. He presents this as a perfect, logical solution, a way to have both love and worldly success. He expects her to be overjoyed, grateful. He has, in his own mind, offered to sacrifice his ambition for her honor. Her reaction is not what he expects at all. She argues against the marriage. Vehemently, passionately, her arguments, as Abelard recounts them, are a stunning blend of selfless love, fierce intellectual pride, and a remarkably clear-eyed understanding of the world they live in. First, she tells him, "Think of your career. What honor could she win from a marriage that would bring him nothing but dishonor?" she asks. She knows that a wife, even a secret one, would be a dead weight on his philosophical ambitions. He is a universal genius, a man who belongs to the world, not to a single household. She argues that the demands of a family, the crying of a baby, the chatter of servants, the endless domestic concerns are fundamentally incompatible with the serene, focused life of a philosopher. What harmony can there be between a scholar and a cradle? She famously asks. She quotes the great thinkers from Street Paul to Cicero on the miseries of married life for a man of the mind. She uses his own intellectual weapons against him, turning his beloved logic back on his proposal. Then, her argument takes a more personal, and even more radical turn. She tells him that she does not want to be his wife. She would prefer, she says, to be his whore or his mistress. Let's pause on this shocking statement. For a medieval woman, marriage was the ultimate goal, the only path to respectability and security. To reject it so forcefully is almost unthinkable. Historians have debated this passage for centuries. Or was this a rhetorical flourish, an attempt to manipulate him into abandoning the idea? The truth is likely complex. Her statement is a radical assertion of her own desires. She is saying that she values their love in its pure, untethered form more than any social contract. The title of wife is a legal and social construct. Their love is something transcendent. The name of wife may seem more sacred, she argues, but the name of lover was always sweeter to me. She wants the freedom of their love, not the chains of matrimony. She wants to be a partner in his intellectual life, not the manager of his household. There's a fascinating, perhaps slightly cynical, interpretation of her argument. She knew Abelard's character better than anyone. She knew his pride, his ambition, his deep-seated arrogance. She understood that if he married her and his career subsequently stalled, he would grow to resent her. He would see her, and their child, as the anchor that had dragged him down. Their love, which had been born of freedom and intellectual excitement, would curdle into a bitter domestic obligation. By refusing marriage, she may have been trying to save not just his career, but their love itself. But Abelard is resolute. His mind is made up. Perhaps his honor is at stake. Perhaps he feels a genuine duty to her and their child. Or perhaps in his pride, he simply cannot stand to be contradicted. He has decided on a course of action, and he will not be deterred, not even by the woman he is trying to protect. He overrules her objections. He is the man, the master, the logician. His solution is the correct one. Reluctantly, you see her agree. Her arguments have failed. She will become his wife, but she is filled with a sense of foreboding. As she prepares to leave Brittany, she tells him, through tears, a prophecy. She says that in marrying, no more remained for our destruction than this, and that in our ruin we should both be involved. She sees the future with a terrifying clarity that he, blinded by his own clever solution, cannot. They leave their son, Astrolabe, in the care of Abelard's sister. This must have been a heartbreaking decision, but a necessary one. A baby would be impossible to hide in Paris. With heavy hearts, they set out on the road back to the city, back to her uncle, back to the secret ceremony that Helois believes will be the beginning of their end. They return to Paris under a shroud of secrecy and apprehension. The city that was once the stage for their public romance now feels like a lance, now feels like a lance, now feels like a lance as their way. Every person who glances their way seems to be a potential danger. They go directly to Ful Bert's house, the place where it all began. The atmosphere inside is thick with a tense, unspoken truce. Ful Bert is civil, but his eyes are cold. The warmth he once had for them is gone, replaced by a brittle, formal politeness that is more chilling than open anger. The plan for the secret wedding is set in motion. It has to be done carefully with as few witnesses as possible to minimize the risk of the secret getting out. Abelard is a public figure. A wedding ceremony, even a small one, is a difficult thing to hide. One night, they gather. You are there, in a small stone chapel, lit by the flickering, unsteady light of just a few tallow candles. The air is cool and smells of old stone and melting wax. Shadows dance in the corners of the room. It is a scene that should be filled with joy and hope, but instead, it is saturated with a heavy sense of dread. There are only a handful of people present. There is Abelard, looking not like a triumphant groom, but like a man completing a grim but necessary task. There is Helois, her face pale in the candlelight. Her earlier protests have been silenced, but her expression is one of profound sorrow and resignation. She is going through with this for him, but her prophecy of their shared ruin hangs in the air between them. Canon Nephew Albert is there, of course. He stands stiffly, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He is getting what he demanded, the restoration of his family's honor. But there is no joy in him. He watches the proceedings with the cold detachment of a man settling a debt. And there are a few of his most trusted friends brought in to serve official witnesses. They are the guarantors of the secret, their presence meant to ensure that the marriage is legally binding, yet remains hidden from the world. A priest, looking slightly nervous to be presiding over such a clandestine, inconsequential union, begins to recite the Latin rites of matrimony. Let's talk about marriage in the 12th century. It was a more fluid and varied institution than it is today. For the nobility, it was a complex negotiation of property and alliances. For common people, it could be as simple as a public declaration of consent between the man and woman, a so-called clandestine marriage. The church was increasingly trying to assert its authority, insisting that true marriage had to be blessed by a priest. It's secret and private like a clandestine union, but it has the official sanction of a priest and witnesses, making it legally unsacramentally valid. Scholars still debate the exact legal status of such unions, but for the people involved, this was a real and binding vow. The vows are exchanged in low voices that seem to be swallowed by the cavernous silence of the chapel. A ring is placed on a finger. A final blessing is given. It is done. Peter Abelard and Helois are now husband and wife. After the ceremony, they part ways almost immediately, scattering back into the night before the sun rises. They cannot live together as man and wife. That would expose the secret. They must continue their charade. To the world, he is still the celibate Master Abelard, and she is still Canon Nephew Albert's scholarly niece. They meet in secret, their rendezvous now having the legal sanction of marriage, but also a new layer of danger. But a secret known by several people is not a secret for long. Nephew Albert, despite his promise of silence, begins to break his word. He is a man consumed by his wounded pride. Having the secret knowledge of the marriage is not enough for him. He needs the world to know that his honor has been restored. He begins to drop hints to his friends and colleagues. He starts to treat Helois with a new harshness, perhaps to punish her for the shame she brought upon him. The situation becomes unbearable for her. She is trapped in a house with a man who now despises her, living a lie that is rapidly unraveling. The secret, which was meant to protect Abelard's career, is now putting her in physical and emotional danger. Abelard, seeing her distress, makes another fateful decision. He needs to get her out of that house. He needs to find her a safe place to stay until Fulb's anger cools. And he thinks of the perfect refuge. Abelard's decision to move Helois is born of a genuine desire to protect her. The atmosphere in Fulb's house has become toxic. Her uncle's initial satisfaction with the secret marriage has evaporated, replaced by a simmering resentment and a pattern of verbal abuse. Albert feels cheated. He wanted public vindication, but is bound by his promise to secrecy, so he takes his frustration out on the only person available. The secret that was meant to create peace has instead created a private hell for her, and so Abelard devises a new plan. He will take her to a place of safety, a sanctuary where her uncle's anger cannot reach her. He chooses the convent of Argentoul, on the outskirts of Paris. This choice is not a random one. Argentoul is the very same convent where Helois had been sent as a young girl for her early education. It is a familiar place, a world she knows, run by nuns who would have remembered her as a bright and promising child. On the surface, it seems like a compassionate and logical choice. I returned to a safe harbor from her childhood. You travel with them on the short journey from the heart of Paris to Argentoul. The convent sits in a quiet pastoral setting, a stark contrast to the noisy, crowded city. Abelard's plan is that she will live there temporarily, not as a nun who has taken vows, but as a long-term guest, a boarder. She will wait there until the situation with F.U. Albert has calmed down and they can figure out a new way to live their secret married life. When they arrive, Abelard provides her with a set of nun's vestments, a habit identical to the one worn by the professed sisters of the order. This is a practical measure. By dressing as a nun, she will blend in. Her presence will be less conspicuous, and she will be afforded the respect and protection given to a woman of the church. It is a disguise, just like the one she wore when she fled to Brittany. Another piece of bitter, unintentional foreshadowing. You watch as she puts on the habit. The simple, dark wool robes, the veil that covers her hair. The transformation is immediate. The brilliant young scholar, the passionate lover, the new mother, disappears beneath the anonymous uniform of a bride of Christ. Here we encounter a crucial point of historical misunderstanding. In the 12th century, it was not entirely uncommon for women to enter a convent temporarily. It could be a place of refuge from a violent husband, a place to wait out a political upheaval, or simply a respectable place for a widow to live. Taking the veil did not always mean taking final, lifelong vows. There was a distinction between being a fully professed nun. Abelard's intention is for Helois to exist in this ambiguous state. But to an outside observer, a woman wearing a habit inside a convent looks like a nun, and this is exactly how nephew Albert sees it. News of Helois's removal to Argentoul reaches him quickly, and in his mind, already twisted by suspicion and rage, he sees not an act of protection, but the ultimate act of betrayal. He does not believe this is a temporary arrangement. He believes Abelard has grown tired of his new wife, that the marriage was just a trick to placate him, and that now, Abelard is getting rid of her by forcing her into a convent. From his perspective, Abelard has cast her aside, repudiating the marriage and dishonoring her all over again. This time permanently. He sees Abelard essentially tricking Helois into becoming a nun so that he, Abelard, can be free of his inconvenient wife and continue his career unencumbered. The academic debate here is intense. Did Abelard truly intend for this to be temporary? His own writings insist that he did. But his actions were, at best, incredibly naive. He failed to see how his solution would be interpreted by his enemy. He was playing chess, moving his pieces according to a logical plan. F.U. Albert was not playing chess. He was preparing for a war. F.U. Albert's simmering rage now boils over into a white-hot desire for vengeance. This latest perceived insult is too much to bear. The secret marriage was a private humiliation. This feels like a public repudiation. He gathers his kinsmen, his friends. They meet in secret, their conversations now dark and violent. The talk is no longer about honor or reputation. It is about punishment. It is about punishment. It is about a physical, brutal revenge that will match the scale of the emotional wound they feel. They decide that Abelard must be taught a lesson. Not with words, not with legal challenges, but with a knife. They begin to plot. They find an accomplice, a man who knows Abelard's habits, his schedule. It's Abelard's own servant. They bribe him. The man, either out of greed or perhaps because he had his own grievance, agrees to help them. He will leave a door unlocked. The trap is now set. Back at the convent of Argentoul, Helois prays, believing she is safe. In his own lodgings in Paris, Abelard sleeps, believing his clever plan has worked. He has no idea that the logic and reason that have guided his entire life are about to be silenced by an act of the most primitive, brutal violence. The night is deep and starless over Paris. The city is quiet, save for the distant barking of a dog or the chime of a monastery bell marking a late-night office. You are in Abelard's lodgings. He has moved out of F.U. Albert's house, of course, and now resides in a rented room, perhaps in the very same building as the lecture hall where he holds his classes. He is asleep. He is a man at the peak of his intellectual powers, his mind filled with arguments about logic and theology. He is completely unaware that the primitive world of violence is about to crash into his ordered, cerebral existence. The door to his chamber has been left unlocked by his treacherous servant. You see the shadows in the doorway deepen as several figures slip into the room. They move with a grim, silent purpose. These are FULBRTS kinsmen, men bound by ties of blood and honor to avenge the shame brought upon their family. And they have FUL Bert himself with them, his face a mask of cold fury in the dim moonlight. They are not here to argue. They are not here to debate. They are here to enact a very specific, very symbolic, and utterly brutal form of revenge. They fall upon the sleeping Abelard. He is jolted from his sleep into a nightmare. He is outnumbered, caught completely by surprise. He struggles, but he is quickly and violently overpowered. They bind him, gagging him to stifle his cries. He is helpless, his mind, the most famous in Europe, unable to reason its way out of this raw, physical assault. And then they do it. With a sharp knife, they perform the act they came for. They castrate him. Let's be very clear about the meaning of this act in the 12th century. This was not a random act of violence. It was a punishment with a deep and horrifying symbolism. In the medieval legal social imagination, castration was a punishment that was seen to fit certain crimes. It was used to punish sexual offenders, men who had violated women or committed adultery. It was a physical manifestation of justice, a way of removing the offending part of the body, the perceived source of the sin. By castrating Abelard, FUL Bert and his men were not just maiming him. They were passing a sentence. They were branding him, in the most visceral way imaginable, as a sexual transgressor, a man ruled by lust, not by reason. It was also the ultimate humiliation. It was an attack on his masculinity, his identity as a man. It was a physical unmaking of him. And crucially, it was a career-ending move. A man who was not whole could not be a priest. This act would permanently bar him from ever reaching the high offices in the church, to which his intellect might have carried him. FULBRTS revenge was meticulously chosen. It was not just to cause pain, but to destroy Abelard's future, to silence his ambition, to take away everything he had and could ever hope to be. The debate about whether the marriage would ruin his career was now moot. This act of violence had settled the question forever. The deed is done in a matter of moments. The men retreat back into the night, their vengeance exacted, leaving Abelard bleeding and in unimaginable pain in the darkness of his room. The aftermath is chaos. His cries of pain eventually attract attention. People come running. The news spreads through the city like wildfire at dawn. The great master Abelard, the intellectual titan, the rock star of Notre Dame, has been attacked, mutilated. The story is on every owner's lips. The whispers and gossip that had followed him for months are now replaced by a wave of shock, horror, and for some of his rivals, a grim sense of satisfaction. Abelard writes that his first reaction, after the searing physical pain, was a wave of shame so profound it was almost worse than the injury itself. The most private part of his body had been made the subject of the most public possible discussion. He, a man who lived his life on the public stage of ideas, was now the center of a crude, humiliating spectacle. He could not bear to face his students, his colleagues, the world. He felt that everyone was pointing at him, laughing at him, laughing at him. The proud philosopher brought low in the most ignominious way. His physical suffering was immense. But as he describes it, the suffering of his pride was even greater. The revenge had been perfectly, cruelly designed to strike him where he was most vulnerable. His body was broken, but his spirit was utterly crushed. The immediate aftermath of the attack is a blur of pain and public humiliation for Abelard. When the sun rises over Paris, it illuminates a city buzzing with the news. The story spreads from the student quarters to the cathedral close, from the marketplace to the royal court. The details are lurid, shocking, and unforgettable. The reaction is a strange mix of pity and schadenfreude. Many are horrified by the barbarity of the act. Justice in the 12th century could be brutal, but this was a private vendetta, a a savage act of revenge that bypassed the law, and the lawyers respond eventually. The public outcry is too great to ignore. F.U. Albert and his accomplices are hunted down. The punishment they receive, however, feels almost like a dark joke. The men who carried out the attack are captured and sentenced to the very same punishment they inflicted on Abelard. Castration. It's an application of the lex d'alien is the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye. F.U. Albert himself, as the mastermind, is punished less severely but still significantly. He is stripped of his position as a canon of the cathedral and his property is confiscated. His reputation is shattered, and he disappears from the historical record, a man utterly ruined by his own obsessive quest for revenge. This is a small, cold comfort for Abelard. His physical wounds will eventually heal, but the deeper wounds to his pride and his future are permanent. He writes that he cannot bear the sight of other people. He cannot face his students, who would now see him not as a master of logic, but as a pitiable, mutilated figure. His lecture hall, once the center of his universe, is now a place of unbearable shame. He feels his life as a public intellectual is over. In his despair, he sees only one path forward. He must retreat from the world entirely. He decides to become a monk. You watch as he makes his way to the great royal abbey of Saint Denis, just north of Paris. This is not a humble, quiet monastery. Saint Denis is one of the most powerful, wealthy, and politically connected abbeys in all of France. It is the traditional burial place of French kings, its abbot a major figure in the kingdom. For Abelard, even in retreat, his ambition and his ego are still at play. He doesn't choose a remote hermitage, he chooses a center of power. But before he takes his final vows, he makes one last decisive and deeply controversial demand. He insists that Helois must become a nun first. This is one of the most debated and painful moments in their entire story. Why does he do this? From his perspective, as he later explains it, he is consumed by a dark and bitter jealousy. He reasons that if he is to be locked away in a monastery, he cannot bear the thought of her being free in the world. He imagines her, young and beautiful, eventually marrying another man. The thought is a torment to him. He is convinced that other men will desire her, and he can no longer be her husband or protector. And so, in an act that feels both selfish and desperate, he commands her to take the veil. He will enter his monastic prison, only if he knows she is securely locked in hers. You travel to the convent at Argenteuil, where Helois receives this devastating command. She is still reeling from the news of the attack on him, her heart filled with a mixture of grief, horror, and perhaps a terrible, crushing guilt. And now the man she loves, the man for whom she was willing to sacrifice everything, is ordering her to renounce the world, to renounce her own future forever. Her friends and family plead with her not to do it. They see the injustice, the cruelty of his demand. She is young. She has a child. She has one of the finest minds in Europe. To bury it all in a convent seems a tragic waste. But she does not resist, as she would later write to him. At your command, I changed my habit and my heart at once, to show you that you were the sole owner of both my body and my spirit. You are present on the day she takes her final vows. It is a solemn public ceremony. She walks to the altar, her face streaked with tears. According to one account, as she is about to speak the words that will bind her for life, she cries out a line from the Roman poet Lucan, quoting the lament of a Roman noblewoman being forced into a political marriage. "O my illustrious husband, why did I marry you to my undoing? Now accept the penalty I have freely chosen to pay for your ruin." With those tragic, defiant words, she takes the veil. The brilliant Helois, scholar and lover, is gone. In her place stands Sister Helois, a nun of the order of Saint Benedict, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience for the rest of her life. Only after he receives the news that she is safely enclosed in her convent does Abelard proceed to take his own vows at Saint Denis. They are now both wedded to the church. Two lives, once so brilliantly intertwined, are now set on separate, parallel paths of penance, their love stories seemingly at a brutal and tragic end. You now find yourself within the cold, imposing walls of the Abbey of Saint Denis. The atmosphere here is a world away from the freewheeling, argumentative environment of the Parisian schools. Life in a Benedictine monastery is governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, a strict and detailed code for communal living that dictates every hour of the day. The day is structured around the Opus Dei, the work of God, 8 daily services of prayer and chanting, starting before dawn with matins and ending after sunset with compline. In between there are periods for manual labor, sacred reading, and meals taken in silence. If Peter Abelard thought he would find a quiet refuge for his wounded spirit here, he was sorely mistaken. His celebrity and his confrontational nature followed him through the monastery gates. He may have taken a vow of obedience, but the habit of intellectual combat was not so easily shed. He quickly finds himself disgusted with the life of the abbey. He sees the abbot, a man named Adam, as a corrupt and worldly figure, more interested in politics and wealth than in spiritual matters. He is horrified by the behavior of his fellow monks, whom he describes as living scandalous, dissolute lives. One of the stranger complaints he makes is about the abbey's very identity. Saint Denis was famously dedicated to Denis, the first bishop of Paris and the patron saint of France. Legend held that this Denis was the same person as Dionysius the Areopagite, a figure mentioned in the Bible as a convert of St. Paul in Athens. Abelard, the ever-critical scholar, reads the ancient texts and comes to a shocking conclusion. The legend is false. The two figures were clearly different men who lived centuries apart. To a modern ear, this sounds like a dry academic quibble. To the monks of Saint Denis, it was a declaration of war. Their abbey's prestige, its wealth, its royal patronage, were all tied up in this legendary connection. To question the identity of their patron saint was to attack the very foundation of their institution. Abelard, true to form, does not just quietly note this discrepancy. He announces it. He argues about it. He makes himself an enormous nuisance. The monks, who had perhaps hoped the famous scholar would bring them prestige, now see him as a heretic and a troublemaker. The man who had been a rock star in the schools of Paris was now the most unpopular man in the monastery. His life becomes unbearable. His fellow monks see him as a threat. His abbot sees him as an arrogant upstart. He is accused of treason for insulting the patron saint of the kingdom. The situation becomes so toxic that he fears for his life. He eventually manages to escape the abbey, fleeing to the countryside of Champagne. He is not free for long. A new abbot, the famous Suger, is elected at Saint Denis. Suger is a brilliant administrator and one of the most powerful men in France, a pioneer of Gothic architecture who would later rebuild the Abbey Church into the masterpiece we know today. He has no love for the troublesome philosopher. He allows Abelard to live outside the abbey, but on one condition. He must never place himself under the jurisdiction of another monastery. He is to be a monk, but a monk in exile, a man without a community. For a while, Abelard lives as a hermit. He builds himself a small, simple oratory, a place of prayer, made of reeds and thatch, in an isolated spot near the town of Troyes. He dedicates it to the Holy Trinity. But the quiet life does not last. His fame is too great. His students, hearing of his whereabouts, begin to seek him out. They leave the comforts of Paris and flock to his wilderness retreat. Soon, a makeshift university springs up in the middle of the countryside. The students build their own huts around his oratory. They sleep on the hard ground and listen with rapt attention as the master, older now, scarred by his experiences, teaches philosophy once more under the open sky. He calls his little sanctuary the Paraclete, a Greek word for the Holy Spirit, often translated as the Comforter. And for a time it seems he has found a measure of peace. He is teaching again. He is admired. He is admired. He is the center of his own intellectual universe once more. He has found a way to rebuild his life, to rise from the ashes of his personal catastrophe, and it is during this period of relative calm, surrounded by his adoring students, that he decides to write his story down. He picks up a quill and begins to compose a long letter to a friend, a letter that will change everything all over again. He calls it the Historia Calamitatum, the story of my calamities. You now watch as Abelard, the hermit scholar, sits down to write. He is no longer the arrogant youth who conquered Paris, but a man in middle age, tempered by suffering and loss. His purpose in writing is, as he states it, to offer comfort to a friend by showing that the friend's own troubles are minor in comparison to his own. It's a slightly self-pitying premise, to be sure, but the result is one of the most remarkable documents of the Middle Ages. The Historia Columitatum is a raw, unflinching, and deeply self-centered autobiography. Abelard recounts his entire life story, his intellectual triumphs, his battles with other scholars, his rise to fame, and then, in excruciating detail, his affair with Helois, the birth of their son, the secret marriage, the brutal attack, and his subsequent retreat into the monastic life. It is part confession, part lament. He casts himself as a victim, a modern-day Job relentlessly persecuted by his enemies and by a cruel fate. His portrayal of the affair is complex. He takes responsibility for the seduction, admitting he was driven by lust and pride. But he also paints a romantic picture of their love, a meeting of minds unparalleled in its time. The tone is a strange mixture of genuine remorse and lingering pride. He is a man still wrestling with his own legacy, trying to shape the narrative of his life for posterity. One of the most debated aspects of the Historia is its accuracy. Is this the unvarnished truth, or is it a carefully constructed performance? A piece of rhetorical self-fashioning designed to win sympathy and restore his damaged reputation. Scholars have spent centuries picking it apart. For instance, he barely mentions their son, Astrolabe, after his birth. The child who was given such a cosmically significant name simply vanishes from his father's narrative. What happened to him? The historical record is tragically silent. Some theories suggest he may have been raised by Abelard's sister, or perhaps later entered the church himself, but we simply do not know. His absence from Abelard's story is a haunting silence. Once completed, the letter is copied and circulated, as was common with important texts in an age before printing. It is a sensation. It is the medieval equivalent of a tell-all memoir, and its protagonist is one of the most famous men of his time. The story of his calamities becomes a bestseller, and a copy of it finds its way to a small, struggling convent near Paris. A copy finds its way into the hands of the abbess. A copy finds its way into the hands of Helois. You can only imagine the storm of emotion she must have felt as she read it. It would have been the first time in nearly a decade that she had heard his voice, and it was telling their story to the entire world. She would have read of his triumphs, his pain, his humiliation. And she would have seen their love, their secrets, their shared past, laid bare for all to see. The story, as he told it, was now public property. Her convent at Argenteuil, the place she had entered at his command, had recently been dissolved under controversial circumstances. The powerful Abbot Suger of St. Denis, Abelard's old adversary, had laid claim to the convent's lands, arguing that they had historically belonged to his abbey. He produced ancient charters to prove his case, charters that many historians now believe were forgeries. They were left homeless, a community of women with nowhere to go. It is at this moment, with Helois at her most vulnerable, that she reads Abelard's story, and she realizes something. The Paraclete, his little oratory in the wilderness that he had since abandoned for a new position as an abbot in Brittany, is sitting empty. It has land. It has buildings. It is a place of refuge. She decides to write to him. It is the first time she has initiated contact in all these years. She picks up her own quill. She has read his story of his calamities. Now, she is about to begin writing hers. The most famous and heartbreaking correspondence of the Middle Ages is about to begin. The silence of a decade is about to be broken. The letter that Helois sends to Abelard is a thunderclap. It is not a gentle inquiry or a quiet note of sympathy. It is a torrent of emotion and intellect, a cry from the heart that has been held in silence for a decade. She has read his Historia Columitatum, his letter of comfort to a friend, and she is incensed. How, she asks, can he write to a friend, yet offer no word to her, the one who has suffered the most, the one whose entire life was sacrificed for him? You have written a long letter of consolation to a friend, she begins, and while it was all about your own misfortunes, you have failed to write a single word to me. The voice that emerges from the parchment is staggeringly powerful. This is not a meek, submissive nun. This is the Helois of the Paris study. Her mind is sharp and her spirit as fierce as ever. Her letter is a brilliant, devastating critique of his silence and his self-pity. She reminds him of the depth of her sacrifice. She tells him she never wanted to be a nun. She took the veil not out of love for God, but out of love for him, and in obedience to his command. The name of God was on my lips, she confesses, but it was you in my heart. She speaks of her undiminished love, a passion that the convent walls and the daily rituals of prayer have been unable to extinguish. She admits that even during the solemnity of the Mass, her mind is filled not with pious thoughts, but with memories of their shared pleasures. It is a shocking, almost blasphemous confession, a declaration that her love for him is a greater and more authentic force in her devotion to God. She challenges his narrative. He wrote of their affair as a sin, a fall from grace driven by his lust. She reframes it as a transcendent love, a union of minds that was the greatest glory of her life. She reminds him of her arguments against their marriage, how she had always valued the freedom of being his lover over the title of wife. She is not ashamed of their past. He mourns its loss, not its sinfulness. This is a critical point of contention between them, and one that historians find endlessly fascinating. Abelard, the theologian, is trying to fit their story into a conventional Christian narrative of sin, punishment, and repentance. He is trying to find spiritual meaning in his suffering. Helois refuses this framework. She sees their story in purely human terms, a great love destroyed by a cruel world. He is writing theology. The exchange of letters that follows is one of the most extraordinary in all of literature. It is a debate, a therapy session, a philosophical treatise, and a raw, open-hearted expression of love and pain all at once. Abelard's reply is, in many ways, maddening. He responds not as her lover or her husband, but as her spiritual director. He tries to steer her away from her memories of earthly passion and towards the love of God. He urges her to accept their fate as a divine blessing in disguise, a painful but necessary surgery that God performed to save them from their sinful lives. He tells her that his castration was a just punishment, a liberation from the lusts of the flesh that allows them both to now serve God more purely. He is trying to comfort her, but he does so by invalidating her feelings, by telling her that the love she cherishes was a sin she must overcome. One particularly poignant undebated detail is the coldness of his tone. He addresses her formally as his sister in Christ, not as his beloved wife. Was this unnecessary piety for a monk and an abbess corresponding? Or was it a deliberate emotional distancing, a sign that he had truly moved on, or was forcing himself to? Some scholars argue he had no choice. Their letters could be read by others, and he had to maintain a proper clerical tone. Others see it as a deep emotional failure, a man so encased in his own theological framework that he can no longer speak the simple language of the heart. Helois will not be so easily redirected. In her next letter, she pushes back again. She accepts his spiritual guidance, but she will not renounce her past or the truth of her feelings. She asks him to be honest. Tell me one thing, if you can, she pleads. Why? Have you neglected me? She demands that he acknowledge his debt to her, that he recognize her unique place in his life. Slowly, through the course of their letters, something begins to shift. He cannot deny the power of her intellect or the depth of her love, and he sees her immediate, practical need. She and her sisters are homeless. He has the Paraclete, his empty oratory, and so he makes a decision. He will give it to them. He will give it to them. He officially deeds the land and its buildings to Helois and her community of nuns. A new chapter in their story, one of collaboration and shared purpose, is about to begin. The Paraclete. The name itself means the Comforter, and now it will finally live up to its name. Abelard officially transfers the title of the property to Helois, and you watch as she arrives with her community of nuns. The place is humble, almost derelict. It is the simple structure of thatch and reeds that Abelard and his students had built years before. It is not a grand, established convent, but a rustic outpost in the wilderness. For Helois and her sisters, however, it is a lifeline, it is a home. And under her leadership, the Paraclete begins to flourish. Helois is not just a scholar. She is a born administrator, a leader of extraordinary talent. She petitions for support from the local bishop, from the nobility, even from the Pope. Her reputation for learning, combined with a newfound respect for her piety and resilience, opens doors. Donations of land, money, and resources begin to flow in. The humble oratory grows into a proper convent, with stone buildings, a chapel, and land for farming. It becomes a beacon of learning and devout life, a testament to her incredible strength and skill. She has found a new kind of power. In the world of Paris, her intellect was a private domestic marvel. Here, as the abbess of the Paraclete, she is a public figure of immense authority and respect. She is in charge. She shapes the community, sets its rules, and directs its spiritual and intellectual life. She has, in a way, finally found a lecture hall of her own. Her correspondence with Abelard now enters a new phase. The raw, painful, emotional debates of the first letters give way to a more professional, collaborative tone. She has a convent to run, and she needs his help. She writes to him with a series of practical and theological questions. She needs a rule of life, a regola, specifically designed for her community of women. The standard Benedictine rule was written for men, filled with details about masculine work and clerical hierarchies that didn't apply to them. She asks him to write a new one for her. This request is a stroke of genius. It's a subtle but brilliant way of re-establishing their intellectual partnership on new, acceptable terms. She is no longer the student asking the master for lessons in logic. She is the abbess asking the famous theologian for professional advice. It allows them to continue their dialogue, to engage their powerful minds in a shared project, but within a framework that is safe, pious, and beyond reproach. Abelard rises to the challenge. He writes an extensive rule for her, along with sermons, hymns, and theological treatises specifically for the nuns of the Paraclete. Their collaboration is fruitful and prolific. Their letters now fly back and forth, filled with discussions on biblical translation, liturgical practices, and the proper role of women in the religious life. Here's a little detail that shows the depth of their work. Proficient in Greek and Hebrew in an age when almost no one in Western Europe was. She would consult with Abelard on difficult passages of Scripture, offering her own insights on the original languages. Their intellectual partnership, which began in that dusty study in Paris, has been reborn. But even within this professional correspondence, you can still feel the echoes of their personal history. In one of his letters, Abelard makes a poignant request. He asks that when he dies, his body be brought to the Paraclete to be buried. He wants his final resting place to be in her care, under the protection of the sanctuary he gave her. It is a quiet admission that despite everything, his life remains fundamentally tied to hers. Historians often debate the true nature of their relationship during these later years. Had their love truly transformed into a purely spiritual, platonic partnership? Or was the formal, professional tone of their letters a necessary mask, a public performance that hid all of that was still very much alive, albeit in a different form? Helois herself provides a clue. In one of her letters from this period, she signs off not just as abbess, but with the phrase, "Thine who was once thy beloved, but is now thy sister in Christ." It is a beautiful, heartbreaking summary of their entire story, an acknowledgement of both the past they shared and the present they must inhabit. They have found a way to be together, but it is a way defined by distance, by parchment, and by the walls of their respective cloisters. While Helois is building her legacy stone by stone at the Paraclete, Abelard's life continues on its familiar, turbulent trajectory. It seems that wherever he goes, controversy follows him like a shadow. His position as an abbot in Brittany, at the remote monastery of St. Gildas de Arhais, turns into a disaster. The monastery is situated on a wild, rugged coastline, and the monks he has sent to govern are, in his own words, a barbarous and unruly lot. He tries to impose discipline to reform their lax and worldly ways, but they resist him at every turn. These are not the eager young students of Paris who hum on his every word. They are rough, independent men who resent this outsider with his fancy philosophical ideas. The situation becomes incredibly dangerous. Abelard writes that they tried to poison him, not once, but multiple times. they would tamper with the food from the kitchen. And when he became suspicious and started eating only at the high table, they allegedly tried to poison the wine in the chalice during Mass. This period shows a man completely out of his element. His greatest weapon is intellect. His power of logical persuasion is useless against the brute force and resentment of his own community. He, who had faced down the greatest philosophical minds in Europe, is now being defeated by the petty conspiracies of a handful of rebellious monks. He eventually flees the abbey, convinced that his life is in danger. Once again, he is a fugitive and exile. He spends the next few years as a wandering scholar teaching and writing, never staying in one place for too long. But his ideas, which had always been on the cutting edge, are now attracting a more dangerous kind of attention. The intellectual climate of the church is changing. It is becoming more rigid, more organized, and more suspicious of thinkers who stray from established doctrine. The main problem is his work on the Trinity. Abelard, in his attempt to use logic to explain the mysteries of faith, described the relationship between God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in ways that sounded, to his critics, suspiciously like heresy. He was accused of diminishing the divinity of Christ, of suggesting that the three persons of the Trinity were merely three aspects of a single God, rather than three distinct persons. These are incredibly subtle theological distinctions. In the 12th century, they were matters of eternal salvation and damnation. His chief accuser is a man who is his complete opposite. This is Bernard of Clairvaux, the most powerful and influential churchman of his generation. Bernard is not a philosopher of the schools like Abelard. He is a mystic, a Cistercian monk who champions a faith based on love, devotion, and humility, not on logic and dialectic. He is deeply suspicious of Abelard's intellectual pride, seeing it as a dangerous arrogance that threatens to undermine the simple faith of the common Christian. Bernard is a brilliant politician and a fiery preacher. He sees Abelard's rationalism as a poison seeping into the church, and he decides that it must be stopped. He launches a relentless campaign against Abelard, writing letters to bishops and the Pope, denouncing his teachings as heretical. The conflict comes to a head in the year 1140, at a church council in the city of Sens. Abelard, ever the debater, arrives expecting a public disputation, a chance to defend his ideas in an open intellectual contest, just like in his glory days in Paris. He has prepared his arguments, ready to dismantle Bernard's accusations with his superior logic. But Bernard outmaneuvers him completely. This is not to be a debate. It is a trial. Bernard has already spent weeks lobbying the bishops, presenting them with a list of what he claims are Abelard's most heretical statements, taken out of context. When Abelard arrives, he finds that he is not a debater, but the accused. He is not given a chance to defend himself. The council, under Bernard's powerful influence, simply condemns his writings. It is a final, crushing humiliation. The great dialectician, the man who had never lost a public argument, is silenced without even being allowed to speak. His life, which began with such intellectual promise and public acclaim, has now ended in public condemnation. The Church, the institution to which he had dedicated his life, has officially branded him a heretic. Broken and defeated, Abelard appeals to the Pope in Rome, but it is a futile gesture. On his journey south, his health, already fragile, begins to fail him completely. The journey to Rome is a journey Abelard will never complete. Exhausted, ill, and spiritually broken by the condemnation at Sens, he seeks refuge at the great Abbey of Cluny, a sprawling and influential centre of monasticism in Burgundy. The abbot of Cluny is a man named Peter the Venerable, a figure known for his wisdom, compassion, and diplomatic skill. He is a friend and admirer of Bernard of Clairvaux, but he also feels a deep sympathy for the disgraced philosopher who has landed on his doorstep. Peter the Venerable becomes Abelard's final protector. He gives him a place of quiet sanctuary within the abbey, treating him not as a condemned heretic but as an honored, if fallen brother. He also undertakes a remarkable act of reconciliation. He travels to meet with Bernard of Clairvaux and, through his gentle diplomacy, manages to broker a kind of peace. He even arranges for Abelard to meet his old adversary one last time, a meeting where some form of personal reconciliation seems to have taken place. More importantly, Peter the Venerable writes to the Pope on Abelard's behalf. He doesn't challenge the condemnation of Abelard's books, but he vouches for the man's personal faith and orthodoxy. The Pope, moved by Peter's appeal, grants Abelard a final mercy. He is allowed to live out the remainder of his days under the care of the abbot of Cluny, his excommunication lifted. He is to live in silence, no longer teaching or writing on controversial topics. You see Abelard in these final months. The fire of intellectual combat is gone, replaced by a quiet, weary piety. He lives the simple life of a monk, his days filled with prayer and gentle study. Those who saw him at Cluny described him as a man of great humility, his famous arrogance finally burned away by a lifetime of suffering. But his health continues to decline. The physical and emotional toll of his life has been too great. Peter the Venerable, seeing that the end is near, sends him to a priory associated with Cluny, a place called Saint Marcel, which was known for its healthier climate. It is there, in the spring of 1142, that Peter Abelard dies. He is around 63 years old. Upon his death, Peter the Venerable writes a letter to Helois at the Paraclete. It is a letter of extraordinary beauty and compassion. He breaks the news of Abelard's death gently, and he praises him not as the controversial philosopher, but as a humble and devout man of God. Thus, dear sister, he writes, the man who is yours now rests in the Lord. God keeps him for you, and will restore him to you at the last day. Then he makes a promise. He tells her that, as per Abelard's final wishes, he will have his body secretly transported to the Paraclete. It's a strange and poignant final act in their story. The man whose life was defined by public spectacle and controversy is now being moved in secret, his body a precious, clandestine cargo on a final journey. You can imagine the scene. A small group of trusted monks, traveling by night, carrying the mortal remains of the great philosopher back to the one place he considered his true home. Helois receives his body at the gates of the Paraclete. She who had been denied a life with him now becomes the guardian of his death. She has him interred in a tomb within the sanctuary of her convent. For the next 20 years she will live and pray and work beside his grave. Her role transforms from his lover, his wife, his intellectual partner, into his final keeper, the preserver of his memory. A fascinating, though likely apocryphal, legend springs up around this time. It's said that Helois would often go to his tomb to pray, and that she requested that upon her own death she be laid to rest beside him. The legend claims that when her tomb was opened to receive his body, the long-dead Abelard opened his arms to embrace her. It's a romantic fiction, of course, but it speaks to a deeper truth that people wanted to believe, that their love was so powerful it could transcend even death. The historical reality is that for 2 decades he would lie in his tomb alone, waiting for her. For the next 2 decades, Helois continues her life's work as the abbess of the Paraclete. Abelard is gone, but his presence lingers everywhere in the hymns she unturned unsing, in the rule they follow, and most tangibly in the stone tomb that now stands as the quiet center of their community. Her grief is profound, but it does not break her. Instead, it seems to temper her, to forge her into an even more formidable and respected figure. Under her guidance, the Paraclete becomes a model convent, renowned throughout France and beyond for its piety, its discipline, and its unique intellectual character. Helois proves to be a master of all the skills required of a great medieval administrator. She is a savvy manager of the convent's growing estates, a shrewd negotiator with local lords and bishops, and a compassionate spiritual mother to the women in her charge. Her own reputation as a scholar, which had been overshadowed for so long by Abelard's fame and their shared scandal, now shines in its own right. She is consulted by leading churchmen, including Bernard of Clairvaux, the very man who had brought about Abelard's downfall. In a remarkable turn of events, Bernard, who had once been so suspicious of Abelard's brand of intellectualism, comes to deeply respect Helois for her wisdom and piety. Their correspondence reveals a mutual admiration, a quiet acknowledgement of her immense talents. She has, through her own merit, transcended the scandal of her youth to become one of the most respected female religious figures of her time. One of the most significant contributions she makes during this period is her work in shaping the Paraclete's specific identity. She insists on a high standard of literacy and learning for her nuns, a direct continuation of the intellectual partnership she had with Abelard. The convent becomes known for its beautiful library and its skilled manuscript copyists. It is a place where women's minds are valued, a small island of female scholarship in a vast sea of male-dominated learning. The academic world still debates the extent of Helias's own original writings. While the letters to Abelard are her most famous works, many scholars believe she also wrote theories in theological works that have either been lost or were not attributed to her. She lives a long life, outliving Abelard by more than 20 years. She sees the Paraclete grow from a humble shelter into a powerful and prosperous institution. She guides a generation of nuns, instilling in them her values of faith, discipline, and intellectual rigor. In the year 1164, Helias dies. She is in her early 60s, a venerable and revered matriarch. Her final wish is simple and unwavering: to be buried in the same tomb as Abelard. Her wish is honored. The tomb is opened, and her body is laid to rest beside his. The two lovers, separated for so long by vows, by walls, and by circumstance, are finally, physically, reunited. The prophecy she made so many years before that their story would end in shared ruin has come true, but not in the way she might have imagined. Their earthly lives were indeed ruined, their personal happiness destroyed. But from that ruin, they each built something new and lasting, a body of work that would influence generations of thinkers, and a sanctuary of faith and learning that would endure for centuries. And here's a strange, almost unbelievable addendum to their story. Their shared tomb becomes a site of pilgrimage. For centuries, lovers and scholars would come to the Paraclete to pay their respects. But their story doesn't end there. During the chaos of the French Revolution in the late 18th century, the Paraclete, like so many religious institutions, is destroyed. The nuns are scattered. But the bones of Abelard and Helias are saved by a sympathetic local who hides them. Over the next few decades, their remains are moved several times, becoming a kind of romantic relic. Finally, in 1817, they are given a grand new tomb in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris. The tomb is a dramatic Gothic revival monument, built from fragments of the destroyed Paraclete, and there they rest to this day. You can visit them. Their tomb is one of the most visited graves in the entire cemetery. It is a tradition for visitors, especially young lovers, to leave letters tucked into the crevices of the monument, messages of love and heartbreak left for the two medieval scholars who became the patron saints of tragic and dying love. Their story, which began in the shadows of Notre Dame, has come full circle, ending back in Paris, a permanent part of the city's romantic mythology. For 2 decades, you watch as a new world takes shape around Abelard's silent tomb. The Paraclete, which began as a desperate refuge, is now being rebuilt in the image of its abyss. Helias, who spent her youth as a student in a man's world, now creates a world of her own on her own terms. This is her final and most enduring act of creation. You walk through the grounds of the growing convent. The original chapel of thatch and reeds is gone, replaced by a simple but elegant stone church. There are dormitories, a refectory for communal meals, and a cloister walk surrounding a garden where the nuns cultivate medicinal herbs. The air smells of lavender, thyme, and damp earth. From the chapel, you can hear the faint, ethereal sound of the nuns chanting the psalms, their voices rising and falling in the ancient Gregorian mode. This is a place of peace, order, and relentless work. But the heart of this place, its true innovation, is the scriptorium. This is the room where manuscripts are copied. In an age before the printing press, this was the only way knowledge was preserved and transmitted. You enter a long, quiet room with large windows to let in the precious light. Several nuns are bent over tall wooden desks, their faces masks of intense concentration. The silence is profound, broken only by the rhythmic, gentle scratch of a quill on parchment. This is not the crude, functional writing of a legal clerk. This is an art form. You watch one sister as she carefully rules a sheet of vellum with a pointed metal stylus, creating faint, invisible lines to guide her letters. Another is mixing ink, grinding oak galls into a powder and combining it with iron salts and a binder like gum arabic. The recipe for good, black, permanent ink was a closely guarded secret. breathing on it to create a faint tackiness before pressing the delicate metal into place. It is slow, painstaking, and deeply meditative work, and for Helois it is essential. The Paraclete is not just a house of prayer. It is a house of the book. Helois's leadership is what makes this place unique. The standard Benedictine rule followed by most monasteries emphasized manual labor, working in the fields, baking bread, weaving cloth. Helois argues that for a community of educated women, the most fitting form of labor is intellectual. She insists that her nuns be literate, that they spend their time not just in prayer, but in sacred reading and the copying of texts. This was a radical idea. Few were structured as active intellectual centers. There's a fascinating academic debate right here. Was Helois a proto-feminist, deliberately creating an institution to empower educated women? But were seen as a primary path to serving God. You see her moving through the convent, no longer the passionate girl from the Paris study, but a woman of quiet, unshakable authority. She inspects the work in the scriptorium, corrects a misplaced Latin phrase, comforts a novice who is homesick, and negotiates with a steward over the price of grain. She is involved in every aspect of the community's life. Peter the Venerable, the kindly abbot who had protected Abelard in his final days, wrote of her, "I have rarely or never seen a woman who was the head of a religious community who combined such prudence with such high-mindedness." Her past is not forgotten. It is woven into the fabric of the place. The tomb of the great philosopher in the chapel is a constant reminder of the convent's origins, a source of both sorrow and prestige. It draws pilgrims and patrons who come to see the final resting place of the famous master Abelard, and they leave donations that help the community thrive. But it is Helois's living presence, her reputation for wisdom and piety, that transforms that initial notoriety into lasting respect. She takes the scandal that defined her youth and builds a sanctuary upon it. The Paraclete becomes her definitive answer to the story of her calamities, a testament not to her ruin but to her resilience. The years continue to pass, flowing like a quiet river around the steadfast stone walls of the Paraclete. Abelard has been in his tomb for nearly 20 years. Helois, now in her early 60s, feels the weight of her own mortality. The vibrant, rebellious girl from her memories is a distant echo. In her place is a woman whose body is growing frail, but whose spirit and intellect remain as sharp as ever. You see her walking slowly through the cloister garden, her black Benedictine habit a stark contrast to the green, flowering plants. Her movements are deliberate, perhaps stiff with age. She has outlived almost everyone from her early life. Her uncle Albert, her protector and her betrayer, is long dead. Benelard's great adversary is also gone. Even the kind Peter the Venerable has passed away. She is one of the last living links to that tumultuous, brilliant era of the early 12th century. Her correspondence from this late period is different. The passionate, heartbroken letters to Abelard are a thing of the distant past. Her letters now are primarily administrative and spiritual. She writes to popes and kings, defending the rights and properties of her convent with a fierce, maternal protectiveness. She writes to her son, Astrolabe, who is now a grown man. The fate of Astrolabe is one of the great, sad mysteries of this story. After vanishing from Abelard's narrative, he reappears in Helois's later life. Historical records are sparse, but they show that she worked tirelessly to secure him a position in the church. We find his name listed as a canon at the cathedral in Nantes, not far from where he was born. It wasn't a high-flying career, but it was respectable. It is through Helois's letters, pleading on his behalf, that we know he survived into adulthood. She never forgot him. She fought for him, this living, breathing reminder of a love that the world had tried to erase. There is a quiet, persistent tragedy in the fact that we know almost nothing about him as a person, his thoughts, his feelings, his relationship with his famous, tragic parents. He remains a footnote in his own story. In her final years, Helois would have prepared for her death with the same meticulous care she applied to everything else. She would have ensured the Paraclete was financially stable, that its leadership was secure, that its rules and traditions were written down and codified for future generations. She was not just an abbess. She was a founder, a lawgiver. One particular document from this era offers a fascinating glimpse into her mind. It's a letter from Peter the Venerable. responding to a series of theological questions she had posed to him. Even in her old age, she was still wrestling with the big questions, still pushing the boundaries of knowledge, still the brilliant student who had captivated Abelard so many years ago. She never stopped learning, never stopped questioning. And then, in 1164, the end comes. You stand by her bedside. The nuns of the Paraclete, her spiritual daughters, are gathered around, chanting the prayers for the dying. Her breathing grows shallow. Her long, extraordinary life is drawing to a close. A life that contained more love, more pain, more intellectual fire, and more quiet resilience than a dozen ordinary lives. Her final request is carried out with solemn reverence. The tomb is opened. The silent, still form of Abelard is there waiting. Her body is laid to rest beside his. The stone slab is lowered back into place, sealing them together for eternity. This final physical union is a powerful symbol. But the question that has haunted their story from the very beginning remains. And it's a question historians will never definitively answer. In the end, which love won? The passionate, earthly love for Abelard that she never renounced? Or the disciplined, spiritual love for God to which she dedicated the second half of her life? Perhaps for her, they were not two separate things. Perhaps her unwavering devotion to Abelard's memory, her creation of the Paraclete as his sanctuary, and her dedication to a life of prayer and study were all part of a single, complex, and lifelong act of love. She had changed her habit, as she had written, but her heart remained her own. The closing of the tomb is not an end. It is a transformation. Their story ceases to be about a living, breathing, suffering people. It becomes a legend. It is absorbed into the cultural imagination, a timeless myth about the conflict between the mind and the body, between love and society, between genius and its terrible, tragic price. And so, you stand before the sealed tomb in the quiet chapel of the Paraclete. The air is still. The flickering candlelight casts long, dancing shadows on the cold stone. Abelard and Helois are finally, indisputably, together. But the world they left behind continues to argue about them, to learn from them, to tell and retell their story. Their immediate legacy is complex. Abelard's philosophical works, though condemned in his lifetime, proved to be enormously influential. His method of using logic to analyze and question, the very method he pioneered in Sikhet, becomes a cornerstone of the new university system. Later, more famous theologians like Thomas Aquinas will build upon the foundations he laid, creating the great intellectual synthesis of the High Middle Ages. His way of thinking helped to win the war for reason within theology. He was a pioneer, and like many pioneers, he was misunderstood and punished in his own time. Helois's legacy is quieter, but in some ways more profound. The Paraclete thrives for centuries after her death, a testament to the strong foundation she built. But her greater legacy is her voice. Her letters, preserved and copied, give us something incredibly rare from the Middle Ages. The unfiltered, fiercely intelligent, and deeply passionate voice of a woman. She is not a silent saint or a symbolic queen. She is a real person, wrestling with faith, love, grief, and ambition. For later generations, especially for women scholars and writers, she becomes an icon, a proof that a female mind could be the equal of any man's. There is a historical debate that continues to this day, a quiet, scholarly argument that echoes the debates of Abelard himself. Who was the greater figure? Was it Abelard, the public intellectual who changed the course of Western philosophy? Or was it Helois, the woman who, from a position of profound disadvantage, built a lasting institution and left behind a literary testimony of unparalleled emotional and intellectual power? There is no right answer, of course. Their story is not a competition. It is a tragedy defined by its very inseparability. Their physical remains continue their strange, restless journey through history. After the French Revolution destroys the Paraclete, their bones are passed from owner to owner, a bizarre tourist attraction. For a time, they are housed in a museum of French monuments. Finally, they are brought to the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris in 1817. You stand now in that famous cemetery. The grand, Gothic tomb that was built for them is a fantasy, a 19th century dream of the Middle Ages. But inside, the dust and bone are real, On the stone effigies that lie atop the tomb, you see their carved, sleeping faces. His, the philosopher, with a book in his hand. Hers, the abbess, with a crosier. All around the base of the monument, tucked into every crack and crevice, are letters. Our letter them, folded and left as offerings. They are from tourists, from students, from lovers. They are written in dozens of languages. They are addressed to Peter and Helois. 900 years after their deaths, people still feel the need to talk to them, to confide in them, to ask them for advice on love and loss. This is their final, and perhaps most unexpected legacy. They have become mythical figures, the patron saints of impossible love. Their story has been told and retold in poems, plays, novels, and films. And in each telling, the emphasis shifts. Sometimes it's a story about the triumph of love. Sometimes it's a cautionary tale about pride and passion. Sometimes it's a feminist fable about a woman's struggle for intellectual freedom. The story is so rich, so full of love, pain, faith, and reason, that it can hold all of these meanings at once. You look at the sleeping stone faces one last time. The brilliant, arrogant man and the equally brilliant, fiercely loving woman. Their story was a catastrophe, a calamity, a ruin, but it was a ruin that left behind a beautiful and enduring monument, not just the one of stone here in Paris, but a monument of words and ideas that has stood for nearly a millennium, a timeless testament to the devastating and generative power of a forbidden love. And so, the story of Peter and Helois finds its final, quiet, or trusting place. A story that began with the ringing of bells in a medieval city. A story of books left open on a dusty table. Of secret vows whispered in the candlelight. And of letters that crossed the chasm of years in silence. Their voices now fade into the quiet of the past, becoming just another soft echo in the long corridors of history. The passion that burned so brightly has cooled into the smooth, cold stone of their tomb. The arguments that shook the foundations of theology have settled into the silence of the library shelf. You can let the details of their lives begin to soften now, to blur at the edges. Like a landscape seen through a misty morning window, their pain, their joy, their struggles, they can all recede, leaving behind only a gentle sense of peace, a feeling of a story that has been told and has found its end. Our journey with them is over. All that remains now is the quiet space they leave behind, a space for your own thoughts to drift and wander, wherever they may lead. As you sink deeper and deeper into a peaceful sleep, the final page is turned. If your eyelids are still not heavy, another story might be the final lullaby you need. Sleep sweetly.